Okay, let's get started. Hello, Anvisha, Jason, Clinton, and hello to everyone in the audience. I am your host today. My name is Natalie, and I'm part of the marketing team here at CoderPad. Thank you again for taking the time to join us as we talk about mitigating gender bias in technical recruitment. So, my hope is that you'll leave this webinar better equipped to identify, dismantle, and prevent gender bias within your tech hiring process. But before we dive in, I wanted to quickly share some practical information. So, first things first, I'd like to introduce my colleague Alice, or CoderPad, as you see her here. Hi, Alice. She is working behind the scenes, making sure that everything is running smoothly. If you need help with anything at all, you can reach out to her in the chat. Secondly, I'd like to remind you that this webinar is being recorded and that you will receive the recording in the next few days. Finally, there will be time for a Q&A session towards the end of the webinar. So if you have any questions for our expert panelists, please submit them in the Q&A tab. You can do so at any time throughout the webinar, and we'll do our best to answer them. So after this quick introduction, we'll meet our wonderful panelists. We'll then get stuck into a roundtable style discussion before moving on to a live Q&A session. So I am joined today by Anvisha Pai, Jason Buchanan, and Clinton Kelly. Panelists, do you think you could tell us a little bit about yourselves? Let's start with Anvisha, then Jason, and then Clinton.
Hi, everyone. I'm Anvisha, based in New York currently, and the weather is surprisingly good at the moment. I am the founder and chief product officer at Dover. I actually started out as our CTO, so I've worn both hats. I started my career at Dropbox, where I was on the product team, and that's kind of why I got interested in the hiring space. Dropbox had such an amazing hiring culture and caliber in the early days. And then I've been at it at Dover for 5 years. Dover is a one-stop shop recruiting solution for startups. So we have all the software, including a free ATS, and services that people need to hire. We've helped hundreds of companies hire, including some bigger names like Stripe, Banta, Benchling, and so on. And I'm excited to be a part of this panel. Diversity and representation in tech is something I feel passionately about. So excited to have the opportunity to discuss with everyone.
Thank you for joining us. Jason, could you go next?
Yeah, so I'm Jason Buchanan. I'm a director of engineering at Empower. We are a retirement services and wealth management provider. I've been responsible for all of our back-end engineering hiring for the last 5 years. And more recently, have taken over all of our sort of hiring approaches for mobile, front-end, and back-end. Really passionate about developing diverse teams. I myself have achieved a lot of great things in diversification in our teams. I'm really proud of that. And so happy to share that experience with you all here today.
Thank you so much.
Hey, my name is Clinton Kelly, and so I'm the non-technical person here when it comes to software engineer work. I have a background in industrial and organizational psychology, and that's what I've worked in for the last approximately 20 years. At IOPredict, I help organizations implement hiring practices, so tests, whatever that test may be, a multiple choice test, structured interviews, a technical coding test. I help them implement tests and ensure the tests they're using for hiring are valid and legally defensible tests and are going to help result in selecting the best people for the job. I'm based out of Sacramento, California, and yeah, so happy to be on the webinar today.
Thank you. We are very happy to have you all. So now that we are all acquainted, let's talk gender bias in recruitment. And actually, just to sort of make sure that we're all on the same page, Clinton, do you think you could get the ball rolling by quickly defining gender bias in relation to the hiring process?
Yeah, so sure. There are probably a few different ways we can do this, but from my IO psychology kind of background, I would say that I would define gender bias as either intentional or unintentional non-job related discrimination. And the reason why I say non-job related discrimination, because in selection, we actually talk about discrimination in a good way. You want to discriminate in the hiring process between those who can do the job versus those who can't do the job. So there is good discrimination and there is bad discrimination. And so I would say it is non-job related, intentional or unintentional discrimination. And I differentiate that between one thing I want to explain is that I see a difference between, just because we have differences in hiring practices and like who maybe passes a test does not mean that it is a bias test. There is a difference between just score differences or hiring differences and bias. An example I like to give is, let's say we give a math test. I'm horrible at math and I get a 25% on a math test. And Anvisha takes that same math test and she does really great and gets it 95 on that math test. Would we say that test is biased against males? No, it reflects actual differences in math abilities. I am not very good at math. So if it's reflecting actual differences in abilities, I would say that is not biased. So it is non-job related discrimination. And hopefully that helps.
Yes, thank you. And I actually really liked the example that you gave in a discussion prior to this webinar. It's like completely out of technical context, but you were talking about, say, tests to get into the fire service and sort of physical strength tests, where there might be where there would be differences, and possibly a group of female identifying candidates would perform less well in sort of a strength-based test. That doesn't mean that that test is biased against that group. It just, like you say, is evaluation of that skill, so to say.
Yeah. And most tests, in all honesty, a lot of hiring tests will result in hiring differences by some group status, whether that be gender, ethnicity, or some protected group status. And so that's why it's important to know the difference between bias versus just there's differences. They're job related, sometimes differences that just happen as an occurrence of the test that you're using versus bias. And so when you do a good job of putting together your hiring process, it's also important to be able to stand behind it and say, hey, if there are some differences, to say we're doing the best we can, we're evaluating this, but just because there's a difference doesn't mean you need to throw it away.
Right. And so when you are looking at your process and what you're putting in place, how would you go about identifying what is a bias in your recruitment process?
So the first thing I would do is just to look at those numbers, is just to look at your selection or hiring ratios. Just so how many do we have applying from each gender, from each group status? How many end up passing each step of the process, our resume screening, our interview process, our technical test. So you look at your input and your output at each stage of the process, and that would be the first step. And then from there, but like I said, just because you have differences, then it means like, okay, is that an actual bias? And one of the key things I think when it comes to identifying whether something is a bias, it comes back to something that in my field we do all the time. It's called a job analysis. I think we need to understand, we need to analyze the job that we're hiring for and understand the requirements, the technical requirements, the knowledge, skills, and abilities required in those positions. So we can identify, do we have a good match between the steps we have in a hiring process and the legitimate requirements of the job, and tying it back to make sure every step is in fact a job related requirement. There's a lot more to that, but at a broad level, that's what I would start with, is looking at your job analysis and linking the test, your hiring steps back to requirements of the job.
Thank you. I was wondering, Anvisha, if you could answer this one for me, but I was thinking, at what stage of the process do you think that gender bias has sort of the most detrimental impact? Where have you seen it do most damage?
Yeah, so I'm going to focus this on recruiting, because that's what we're sort of talking about today. And I'll focus it on kind of like the startup tech world. I'm assuming everyone who's attending this webinar right now cares about this topic, right? So we're not in a world where there's still like so many industries and kind of workplaces where it's not even something that's recognized, and there's like probably pretty rampant gender bias, but I'm going to assume here that everyone here is like aware of what it is and is trying to sort of like avoid that. So in that world, so what I have seen just from being involved in like a lot of companies recruiting processes and see what they do, it's definitely more rampant in the earlier stages of the process and in the more subjective parts of the process. So for technical hiring, when you're getting to the point where you're doing like a whiteboard question or an on-site or, or like a collaborative coding exercise in CoderPad or what have you, you're getting into these more kind of rigorous aspects. And so there can still be bias in those parts too. It's it's going to be a little bit less prevalent. But in the earlier parts is sort of where I see do the most damage. So I'm talking about like resume review. There's like no rigorous system for resume review. And pretty much it's like a very ad hoc process. Like sometimes recruiters are doing it, sometimes hiring managers, sometimes team members. And there's a lot of biases that come into play at that step. So a lot of people are just like not getting into the process. And obviously, like there's kind of some more apparent indicators of bias, right? Like job gaps, which we see prevalent amongst, mothers and things like that, because or people caring for an elderly relative. So that's something that I've actually just seen, even for well-intentioned people, kind of turns into a problem. Like how many times have we heard people say like, "Oh, job hoppers, job gaps"? Like I'm just going to just reject that resume right away. I think that I've also seen a little bit of it in behavioral interviews, particularly like in the, when I say behavioral, I mean anything that's like not a technical interview. So like even like a intro phone screen or just kind of an early in the process sort of behavioral interview. Yeah, these tend to be like people are bringing in their own biases of like what good looks like in a behavioral context.
Right.
And that tends to bring in a lot of sort of gender bias. So that's kind of where I've seen it. I'm happy to chat more later on about like what I think people can do to combat this, but this is sort of kind of my take there.
Yes, and yes, we will definitely get to sort of tactics to tackle that. I think just to start with, I wanted to sort of talk about where to look, how to identify these kind of gender biases, how to analyze your current hiring process, and yeah, sort of where to get started and how to know what areas of action you can identify. And we can sort of get to this in the Q&A as well if people do have questions about this. And I think diversity efforts, I think it's something that it sort of moves around in recruiters' priorities depending on the current context, depending on their company's context, depending on sort of economic and hiring context. And I know that we run an annual survey and we asked recruiters last year about their priorities, about what they're planning to invest in, both time and budget. And talent diversity last year was in 4th position, so behind talent retention, candidate experience, and expanding their talent pool. This year's survey is still in progress, but early results show that talent diversity has dropped to 7th place, so behind things like implementing AI, candidate experience, and candidate assessment. Do you think that diversity in hiring is still important to employers? Is it still prioritized in general and in tech specifically? Maybe Jason, you have some thoughts?
Yeah, so I think with the Black Lives Matter movement, we saw a lot more diversity, equity, and inclusion leadership positions created in companies to specifically focus on diversity. I think it was a hot topic back then, but now I'm seeing sort of established roles, very executive level positions that are focused on diversity. So I think when you look at a survey, it may not be the hot topic of the moment, but I think that's more so because there is this established position now of someone in HR or C-suite level who's focused on diversity. I think that instills a lot of training programs and a lot of trickle down awareness to the associates of understanding bias in general across various attributes. But I don't think that it is becoming less important just by dropping down the ranks. I think it's just less top of mind because there is this establishment already from
Sort of
recent
less
years.
new and more of an ongoing challenge.
Exactly. Yeah.
I think that's reassuring to hear. I hope that that is the case. But I'll be very interested to sort of have more feedback, qualitative feedback from the survey respondents. Um, so AI being in the sort of the new hot new topic, it has been taking up a lot of space lately, kind of everywhere, but in hiring also. Um, do you think that it could be taking focus away from diversity efforts, or is it benefiting them? Is it something that can actually boost existing diversity efforts? Anvisha, maybe do you have some thoughts?
Yeah, I spend a lot of time thinking about and working in AI. Here's my kind of like hot take on it. So the most useful way to apply AI in recruiting right now
Hmm.
is to like automate or take away a lot of the manual tasks. So scheduling, coordination, like email outreach, like that kind of stuff.
Hmm.
So I would argue that it's actually like freeing up more time for recruiters and the hiring team to be more highly leveraged, um, to actually focus on things that are going to improve diversity across not just the recruiting process, but like the entire company
Hmm.
and making it like a great place to work. So that's kind of that's one statement that I'll make, and I feel just from having seen that, just from our own product, for example, like people are just getting more time back to do like more high leverage things, and
Hmm.
then what you do with that time, you can spend it on diversity or whatever is important to you. Um, the other thing that I'll say is I actually think the interesting thing about AI, so there's a lot of talk about bias in AI,
Right.
which is correct, but there is also a lot of bias in people. And the tricky thing about bias in people, I think it's like harder to identify and measure, and people are defensive and they are sensitive and they don't know when they're wrong or right. And you can't like really examine them in the same way
Mm.
that you can potentially examine like a, you know,
An
program
AI
or machine
model.
learning
Yeah.
system. I do think this is like kind of one of the drawbacks of just generative AI, which is that you don't understand how these LLMs are actually working. So you can't like pull them apart and pick them apart and say like, okay, what's the part that's biased? Like, what's the part
Hmm.
that's saying an engineer is going to be male or whatever? But there is a lot of research happening in those directions, and so pretty hopeful that um, AI can actually be leveraged to not just save you time so you can focus on diversity, but actually help you be less biased.
Hmm.
I don't think we're quite there yet, but I think we will hopefully get there very soon at the pace things are going.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And I think one thing I'd add, sort of coming back to what you were saying, Clinton and Anvisha, about um, having like a standardized process, being able to um, have consistency in your process. And I think a lot of AI tools can help you do that. And that is one way that you can reduce bias within your process. Um, Clinton, do you want to add something?
I was just gonna completely agree with Anarisha and you, Natalie. That comment is adding structure to the hiring process. In my opinion, it makes any bias transparent and part of the process, so it's fixable. And I think throughout history of like in my field, you look at like decisions, and people often fight against what I call the machines making decisions, whether it be algorithms or structured or standardized processes. And they want to go back to their intuitive approaches where they kind of do what they want, and that introduces so much more bias, and you can't identify it. Like Anvisha had mentioned, then it makes the bias so it's in this black box. So when I just say, I just interview people and I just know who's the right person,
Mm.
that introduces so much more bias. Then you say people are afraid of maybe an AI that has a structured algorithm. There you can at least go back and identify, okay, what is happening in this process that
Hmm.
may or may not be introducing some bias. Whereas it's hard to delve into the black box of the mind of your hiring manager to figure out what biases they have that's introducing bias into the process. And so structure actually reduces bias by making your process transparent so you can identify what is or isn't causing an issue.
Right. Um, so be it with AI assisted tools, or other efforts that are being made, I think progress has been made. Um, Jason, you've actually successfully, like you said, built a tech team that has a 50-50 gender split. I think that's amazing. And I would love to sort of hear about that experience. How was that possible? How did you do it?
Yeah, so with our recruiting funnel, everything starts at top of funnel, which is the candidates that are applying for the job. So that's where we first focus. I'm looking at both the composition and structure of our job descriptions. We can use tools to analyze the job descriptions to determine, is it a masculine focus or feminine focus or neutral, using what words we're using in the job description. Because if a woman sees a word that maybe is too masculine, or if the job description reads too masculine, they may not apply for it. Also, we focus on the structure of what are the minimum qualifications versus preferred qualifications, to really highlight, here's what we need you to have, and here's what we'd like you to have. So again, focus on, this is just what we need, this is what you must have, and this is the sort of the nice to have. So still apply even if you don't have those. We also saw a lot of, when people do apply for these jobs, we see that they ask a lot of questions about education. So we, as a company, have started to review: is a bachelor's degree actually required, or is some relevant experience actually acceptable? We've also looked at education as something that we may or may not put into a required qualification for the job. So starting at top of funnel with job descriptions, job postings, where we post our jobs as well. If we're looking to increase the number of female candidates that we have, looking at different resource groups in universities, or even in employment, people that are focused on women in STEM jobs, putting our job postings there. So spending quite a bit more money on to try to target women in general for that. Later on, as part of our interview process, ensuring that we also have diversity in our interview panel, where we have 50-50 on the interviewers. So we have someone who is a person of authority, which we have multiple of these, where we have both a female and a male who's an engineering manager interviewing the candidate. And then we also bring in peers, someone who's in that same job role, both male and female, to interview the candidate. Just to again have it in that sort of feedback loop internally, that we are also getting diversity in our interviewers. So I think that's really helped us hire 50-50. And the bottom line is just being aware and setting it as a goal. This is something many years ago we said, in engineering, we have a really, this ratio of typically like engineering graduates, like 25% female. We understood that the pool's going to be smaller, but we want to actually focus on getting that 50-50 equity. So that's really setting it as an actual goal has helped us focus on that specifically.
Thank you so much. Now I'd love to share some sort of statistic on this many companies have like a 50-50 gender split as a goal, or this many companies have a tech team that is it's like that has a 50-50 gender split. I have found no such number, but I do highly doubt that many tech teams have managed to reach gender parity, but I do think that progress is being made. And I'd like to know, sort of panelists, what you have noticed in the industry, in where you work or in other companies, that you would tag as positive progress. Sorry.
First of all, Jason, I really loved your approach. I think it's so true. Like, you have to kind of think about it like every part of the process, not just like, why aren't there female candidates applying? Like, the pool must be small, and then leave it at that, right? I think that's kind of related to my progress point. So with Dover, we have a lot of customers coming in who are like, hey, I want to hire for this and that. And we're just seeing a lot of people coming in where they're like, hey, I want to hire for X role, but I want to make sure my pipeline is like 50-50, or I want to make sure my pipeline is like even more than 50-50, There's a lot of folks that come in, and unfortunately, this is like just so common in the startup world, where like they just have like an all male engineering team, and they're like, okay, we need to hire someone who's not a white male for this team. Like, how do we do it? And the fact that they just like care, and they're genuinely starting to take action is one thing that I noticed as progress. And the fact that they're willing to slow down their time to hire by doing something like focusing on sourcing only 100% underrepresented candidates. Like, that's going to have like a tangible business impact. But if you're willing to make that trade-off, like, that means that you truly like care about it. So to me, those are all sort of like positive signals. I also think that the kind of like just more transparency with like people are, very good about using scorecards. And that, I mean, I think it's kind of an accepted thing at this point in the industry where you're like going to write down your feedback and write down your scores, and stuff like call recording and things of that nature. Just there's more transparency. And so if there's someone in the loop that's like not, not like on the same page about bias in the hiring process, it's like easy to identify and like correct it.
Mm-hmm.
And now, just to add to that, I was just going to say from my perspective, about 6-7 years ago, I don't think I had ever had a client who called me for a software engineering or tech type of role to help them in the process. And about 6 years, I started getting those phone calls. And now actually a good portion of my work is implementing helping organizations in the hiring process for technical roles. And so far, what I call software engineering related type of roles. And so I think that's a good sign. It's like before, like I said, I remember when I first got that call and I said, well, I've never done this job before. I do a lot of different jobs. And now I would say it's almost half of the work that I do is on tech hiring.
Yeah, I think
so I think just that's a good sign.
The fact that it is a goal is
people who call me, they usually don't call me unless they're really trying to make efforts to ensure their hiring process are like that. I usually don't get that phone call unless they're really concerned about it.
Right. Thank you so much. I feel like that's very positive notes. But I am fully aware that this is an ongoing challenge and that there is so much more that companies can do. And I feel like obviously the people that are here with us today, that's what they want to do. They want to be able to address gender bias in their hiring process. So something that I wanted to address, and this is something that we've discussed internally, is sort of prerequisites for tackling gender bias, sort of just the groundwork. And I'd say that there are 5, this is not an exhaustive list, but there are 5 that I've identified. That's to get executive buy-in. So to really engage your executive team in your diversity goals and to get them sort of to back you up and to be there, sort of pulling in the same direction. Number 2 would be to get the stats, to know your numbers, to know where you are currently in terms of gender diversity in your current workforce, gender of applicants, retention per group, that kind of thing, sort of know what your hiring process looks like now. Number 3, to map your hiring journey. So to actually officially, formally document your current process in each of the steps. I'd say number 4, to set clear goals, quantitative, qualitative metrics to follow. And number 5, I'd say to document any existing initiatives or efforts, policies that are in place, whether they're widely adopted or not, but anything that you have already put in place. I'd say that that's kind of the groundwork, step 1. Do any of you want to share any specific advice relating to any of these items?
Yeah, I can chime in here. I think with the DE&I efforts, we've had a lot of focus on unconscious bias training, acknowledging that we all do have unconscious biases and making ourselves aware of that, especially right before anything that we're doing in our recruiting work. For example, before reviewing a bunch of resumes, going through and realizing you're going to have unconscious bias reading these. As Anvisha mentioned, like job gaps historically have been stigmatized as negative, but we need to rethink that. So just establishing that right before you start reviewing the resume, knowing that job gap is something that you should not, penalize a candidate for. And so, and then even when we are doing our actual interviewing, when we're speaking to candidates, just acknowledging that people have different personalities, and the way that you speak to them could make them react a certain way. I've had to coach a lot of my engineering managers that are interviewing with how to have more emotional intelligence, to not come across as rapid fire technical questions, very aggressive. How do you ease back and really understand the attitude of the candidate versus just the technical skills? I think for me that's really helped us in our hiring.
One thing
go ahead, Amisha. Yeah.
One thing I wanted to sort of call out is just sort of like you make what you measure, right? And I do think that actually sort of, and it doesn't have to be like super detailed or anything, but like just one story from our time at Dover, despite the fact that we ourselves are a smaller company, we just looked at what percentage of our applicants across all jobs were identifying as female. And we were like, hey, we're going to increase this percentage split. We're going to try to make it 50-50. So we just did a bunch of things, like a lot of the stuff that Jason was kind of mentioning earlier, to get to that point. But the fact that we made it a priority and someone was in charge of it and had to report on it and share their findings with the company, like made it happen, both like across like getting executive buy-in and you know, actually getting the resources to like do certain things.
Yeah, I agree with both of you, and I think you have to be, like you said, strategic in your hiring process. You have to go back looking at that job analysis. Like I said, what are the actual requirements of the role? Like Jason said, sometimes I find actually hiring managers regularly want to ask questions or put things on technical tests that are beyond entry level, that are things that they have this thing. I hear this a lot where they say, this one time in my job, I had this one situation come up. Oh, that'll be a great question. And I ask them, well, how often does that happen in your career? Like once. And how long you been doing this? 20 years. Like, so is that the best question to ask your incoming job applicants who are brand new? And so being able to identify what are the day one requirements of this job and focusing your hiring process on those things. From a legal perspective, you will actually lose in court if your hiring process includes questions that are beyond entry level. So if you're asking for things that are, you expect someone to know a year into the job, you know, later in the job, technically that's not fair game and part of the hiring process. And so your hiring process should include content and questions that are day one requirements of the position. So take a look back at that job, analyze the job, identify, are these truly day one requirements that we're including as part of our interview process or selection process?
Thank you all. I think that's great advice. I want to be a little bit mindful of time. I see there's lots of questions, so I want to make sure we have time for a Q&A. I did just quickly want to call out some sort of tools, resources, that kind of thing. What has been most helpful to you as part of your effort to reduce gender bias in hiring? Sorry. Anything that you would share with the audience?
I think there are lots of free tools out there that help you paste any text. Could be your job description, could be your interview questions, that will tell you if they are biased by gender. And that will even make suggestions on how you can reword those to come across more neutrally. So I would really encourage everyone to use that. And then also, doesn't matter what the tool is, if it's some fancy tool that's doing your HR measurements, whatever, or a simple spreadsheet, but showing teams what their breakdown is, sometimes just the awareness is key. That will you know, ignite some change if people are just aware that, hey, your team is 75% male versus the other teams are 50% male. Just that simple awareness can actually trigger them to start thinking differently in their hiring practice.
Thank you. Clinton and Visha, did you have anything that you wanted to add, or shall I jump to questions?
One thing I'll just, this is not quite like the bias side, but I think one of the ways you can kind of get more diversity in your funnel is by doing sourcing. So like actually reaching out, not waiting for people to apply, especially if you're a smaller company or don't have as much of a brand. Dover is just one example, but there are many sourcing tools out there, and you can craft a strategy which focuses on diversity. I found that to be very effective.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, I think I don't really have any additional to add. I think I'm sure there'll be much more with the questions here as we get into them.
Yes. Okay, so let's move to questions. Thank you so much to everyone in the audience who has been sending questions in. Well, we just mentioned sourcing, so that's a good transition. We do have a couple of questions on sourcing in tech. So one question here, I'm trying to hire software engineers and I don't get a lot of female candidates. Our engineering staff is overwhelmingly predominantly male, but my feeling is that there are simply fewer female candidates out there. So I'm trying to figure out how to attract more female candidates. Does anyone want to offer some advice?
I think beyond the job description changes that we've already talked about with masculine versus feminine words, we've also mentioned a little bit about going after advocacy groups that are specifically focused on, say, women in engineering.
Right.
There are lots of groups out there that have internal boards for postings, and that's one way that we've been able to increase our top of funnel ratios is by specifically targeting those groups. Either women in computer science or even after they've actually started jobs already, there are lots of advocacy groups out there that are focused on specifically like job boards.
I think, I mean, those that are top of mind for me, I think there's women in tech, girls who code. I don't know if any others come to mind that we could share.
Alpha is one.
And I mean, obviously, if you just look for those groups, there are a number of them, and I think sort of it's a way to increase visibility in any case. And then, is your company attractive to those candidates that are seeing your job descriptions? That's another subject, but at least it will increase visibility of those open roles.
Just a quick addition to that. So, like, recruiting, just like any other business, sort of has like the sales component and the marketing component, right? The sales component is kind of like going and sourcing and reaching out to candidates one-to-one. We've already talked about that. On the marketing front, I think that there's actually a lot that companies can do that they're not doing to make, so one of them is obviously partnering with other organizations. But I think one thing that's worked really well for us and companies that we work with is, showing more of like what it's like to actually work in the company. So having like photos or stories from employees at the company across like various, representation. There are some resource, like there's some agencies and things like that that like will actually even help you put together some of those employee stories, and those tend to work really well. Women in particular care about like what kind of workplace they're stepping into, right? The second thing is also if there is like female leadership within the company, like elevating them, getting them to go out and do like podcasts or webinars, getting them to go out and speak publicly. It can be sometimes a lot to ask for someone to do all that in addition to their job. So have to make sure that it's mindful. It's not like, hey, we're putting you out there because you're like our token, like, underrepresented person. But I find that those two are, those two are kind of like a lot of companies don't do that stuff, but at least I found it to be quite effective.
Definitely. I'm 100%. So I'm looking at the questions. Okay, so how the sort of two questions in one. How to promote diversity to attract female talents, especially in IT. So I think we've partly answered that. I think definitely sort of showing behind the scenes what it looks like to work in your company, your tech team, especially if that's a focus area in your hiring and in your diversity efforts, then being able to sort of show what it's like to work as part of the tech team, highlighting, if you can, anybody that's willing to sort of share their story within your company. I think that is definitely a great way to go. But then the second part of the question is, should we ignore good male profiles? Is that a way to improve gender diversity?
I would say myself, I always tell my clients, no, like the goal, I always tell the goal when I come in is to help you hire the best people for the job. And while you want diversity as well, you want to hire the best people. So it doesn't mean you're ignoring other groups. And so I always say implementing a good hiring process, a byproduct of that should be to help increase diversity, but it doesn't mean at the sake of jumping over good candidates and so definitely not.
And another question sort of on the same kind of subject. Someone from the audience is asking if any of you have experience hiring a candidate from a diverse job board. So some of the job boards that we mentioned, if anybody has that experience of sort of from candidate to hire.
We hired 2 candidates through Alpha. It's a little bit different because it's not quite the same as a job board, but you can like promote your company on there. And then they told us they heard about us through that.
Great. And
we've actually, sorry, just real quick, we've sourced a lot of interns from women in computer science. So that organization from universities, specifically, advertising to them, has given us some good interns.
great, thank you. So I have a question here on sort of raising awareness, being an advocate within the company. So somebody from the audience says, we are likely on this call as a result of being passionate about this topic. How would the panelists suggest calling out bias with hiring managers who may not see their words, feedback, etc. as bias? I think this is a great question. It's an age-old.
I guess that was one thing, just the psychologist part of me, says, but it's like in grad school, I remember learning about like performance feedback and performance reviews. And what you do is you focus on the behavior and not the individual. And what I mean by that is if instead of calling someone lazy, an employee, you say, hey, you're lazy. You can say you've been late to work 5 times in the last month. You focused on objective, kind of observable things, and then so it doesn't become personal. It's not a personal attack on someone. So you can't go out and call someone racist, you're biased. And how do you think someone's going to feel when you attack someone personally? They're going to get defensive. So, but if you point at data and objective things, and we're not saying it's your fault, you're not looking to blame or assign blame, you're just looking at the numbers, the data, objective things, then it removes some of that personal attack and that natural I guess tendency to want to be defensive and defend your position as a hiring manager out of it.
Yeah, I 100% agree. Giving data to the interviewers, the engineering managers that are hiring, showing them what their teams are composed of, or even their hiring funnel. What percentage of female candidates are scored a certain way versus the male candidates. So I think for me, engineers they react really well to data. Engineering managers do the same thing. So again, yeah, I not attacking the person per se, but giving them data, showing them here's the state of the world.
Right.
And then also with unconscious bias training, acknowledging that we all do have biases. We just need to acknowledge them and try to prevent that in our analysis of candidates.
Have a look. Okay, so this is specifically about job description, so something that we mentioned earlier. And Jason, you were talking about job descriptions and sort of the vocabulary that's used. So this question is, what are some kinds of words in job descriptions that are masculine focused versus feminine focused? Sort of some examples.
Yeah, there's a lot of lists out there. I'm actually looking at one right now, so let's read a couple of them. Masculine words, things like self-sufficient. Oftentimes we're thinking that someone is just doing the job themselves. That's a very masculine oriented word versus someone who is considerate or empathetic is a more feminine related word. If you say that there's an objective or someone's leading or driving something, those are more male coded words versus someone who is more about interpersonal with their team and sort of being responsive to communication or project. Those are more feminine related words. So a lot of these words, again, feed your job descriptions into these engines that are out there, and they'll highlight the words that are masculine or feminine, and also suggest more neutral words to use that accomplish the same meaning.
And I think I'd add to that, a lot of these words are kind of adjectives. Potentially, this might be an area of your job description that's not subjective. And I think that's also something to look at. Like we were saying, your job analysis, what skills are absolutely necessary, and sort of being able to make that difference between a personality that you personally as a hiring manager appreciate and actually an interpersonal skill or a technical skill that is necessary for that job. And I think there's kind of a difference. So this is a question on interview exercises on assessment. A lot of live coding interview exercises tend to bias against women or candidates that are more methodical. The alternate is providing take homes, but there's the potential for cheating. I'd love to hear any tips on how to make interviews more inclusive, but also retain rigorous technical assessment. It's a great question.
I'm just curious for some more context, like I guess Is it true that live coding exercises are biased against women? That's something that I actually haven't totally heard before.
I think I'm not in the chat, so Alice, let me know if there's any any feedback on that. But what I would Oh, hello.
Sorry. Yeah, hi, I'm here. But I don't follow all the conversation because I'm writing all this chat. So can you repeat the question?
Yeah, so the question was around coding interview exercises that are potentially biased against women or candidates that are more methodical. And the versus take-home exercises where there's more potential for cheating. So the question was any tips on how to make interviews more inclusive, but also retain rigorous technical assessment. So make sure that there's no cheating. And then Anvisha was asking the question about, okay, are coding interviews biased against women? What is the real worry there? What's the yeah, if there's anything behind any context behind that question.
I don't have a lot of additional content, just looking at if it was an anonymous question or someone that's commented back on the chat, but no, sorry, don't have additional context there.
Okay, that's fine. I can take a stab at it. So I don't know what the data shows. I think there are a lot of problems with live coding exercises in general, like gender bias aside. It often, depending on the person's personality or like what they know or what they have for breakfast that day, they may not do a good job in that environment. I think that take homes actually can be designed really well. It's getting harder and harder in the era of ChatGPT, but it's not like you're just doing the take home and then you're like hiring the person. There are assessments after that, right? So we're just trying to get a pulse of like directionally, is this person worth interviewing more? I think the way to approach that is to give a little bit more of an open-ended take home. So try to see like how they're approaching a problem, rather than being like, hey, like, pass these 5 test cases in a take home. Like try to see how they're approaching a problem, like using their systems thinking or like design thinking as a technical person. See them, like give them less scaffolding, like see them write more stuff from scratch. And then it's like, okay, they can like cheat using ChatGPT or whatever, but if they can also use ChatGPT in their job. So if they did a good job on that exercise, they're probably gonna, be worth talking to more. So that's my take.
I think so obviously in the coding exercises that candidates can do in their own time, there are like with CoderPad, for example, there are sort of anti-cheat mechanisms and ways to sort of flag suspicious behavior that you can then look into. And then in an interview, I think if you are worried about bias in your coding interviews, I think possibly there's a way to host a coding interview. I think it's not necessarily a case of do them or not. I think it's going to be difficult to do without for technical positions, but you can definitely look at the way that you're sort of organizing those interviews, how you're communicating with candidates, how you can sort of set them up for success, what you can communicate beforehand to make sure that they're comfortable. Obviously, make sure that everybody has the same information going in. But I do think that's a very interesting sort of action area is your interview panel, your interview questions, standardizing all of that and sort of seeing, if there's any way that you can reduce bias in your interviews, in your live interviews. Did anyone want to add anything on that?
Yeah, I can say, I do a lot of live interviews, and I've crafted my approach over the years to be more focused on the practical aspect of programming. A lot of times somebody may come in and they already know the answer to the problem, or they're going to work through it in silence, just how they work. But oftentimes if someone's struggling, for me, it's much more about, do they communicate their understanding of the problem? Do they ask questions? Do they basically think out loud? It becomes, I changed the question to be a little bit more, okay, let's talk about the requirements. This is what we do every day. We gather requirements, we implement the code per those requirements, we test, we implement, we optimize. It becomes much more focused on that versus getting the right answer. Because ultimately these interviews are not, real life. It's not how we code every day. use resources, we talk to other people, we get feedback. So recentering the interview question more around that approach for me has worked pretty well.
Mhm. Yes, it's collaborative. Clinton, did you want to add something?
Yeah, and I was just gonna say from the test validation, my expert kind of when organizations come to me and they say they want to implement a live coding exercise, that does introduce the potential for more bias, definitely does. And the reason for that is because you introduce lack of structure. There's more of a Wild West. You can go, it's like I liken it to like a choose your adventure book that I used to read sometimes as a kid, where it's like if you skip to page 37 if you want to go, and so you can go multiple different ways with these candidates depending on what they're doing in the live coding exercise. And when that happens, that allows lack of structure to come in, and then allows you to just kind of start asking different questions to different candidates, delving into different details that you don't with some other candidates. And so when clients want to use live coding exercises, I think it's important to put up specific guardrails and instructions and structure around that. Like, here's the things we want to touch on with all of our applicants when they come in. If they go this way, if they start to go this way, how are you going to respond? So you know ahead of time, you have a plan in place. And so there is structure there. So to me, it's all about in live coding, putting structure back into it.
Right. Thank you. I'm going back to the questions. So we have a couple of questions on measuring bias. Okay, one question: women in tech attract other women in tech? Sure. And I look for that when I go to a new company. If people interviewing me are all men, then that's an indicator for me. And the question is so we'd like to put together a more diverse interview panel, both for reasons of viewpoint and representation, but we don't have any women in relevant technical positions. Does it make sense to include someone non-technical in the process for this purpose? I think that's great to be thinking about representation in your interview panel. Does anyone have any advice?
For me personally, in a lot of companies, both at Dropbox and in my current startup, there was always like a kind of social interview or lunch interview, where you sit down with people and they may not be in your direct team. They could be anyone in the company. And in a remote world, at Dover, we've implemented it. We call it a social interview, and like we actually send the person like a DoorDash gift card so they can order lunch and they can do like a virtual lunch with our team. And so in those situations, I think it's actually putting even aside the representation part. I think it's great to have them talk with people from outside of technical teams, because they're going to be working with those people, and it's like an important thing to sort of screen for and also show them like, hey, what it's like outside of the tech team in this company. So I think it's a great idea.
I agree. It's something we actually screen for as well. A lot of our engineers have to interact with product managers. My teams work in sales and marketing. So working with a salesperson or a marketing manager, you need to be able to change the way you communicate. You're not talking about code or what line does what. It's much more high level. So that is something that we screen for. So if you do have employees in those other areas, absolutely add them to the interview panel.
The only caveat I would say there, like I think Jason, you already mentioned, and Visha, I think as well, is when you're depending on the content. So if it's a high technical focus, maybe they're not evaluating that portion, like their technical skills. So just be aware that I was on an interview panel once where it was about to hire someone like me, just test validation. And the other panelists, they were very technical questions, and they were asking other panelists to rate people on their technical skills in this area. And they just looked at me every time. And so just be aware of what you're asking these people to do. But I think it's a great idea in general.
Yeah, I think that's very right. I think that your interview panel as well, any way that you can set them up for success as well, any way that you can prepare them, sort of give them something to focus on. This is what you're evaluating, and be able to work on a structure with them, and then also sort of criteria as well. What does good look like? What does bad look like? What does great look like? Any structure that you can give to your interview panel, and to each of them, depending on what they are assessing, that's gonna, reduce bias. Have a look at the questions here. So one question, sorry. When we talk about 50-50 gender split, and gender diversity goals, where do non-binary people fall into that? How would you approach that?
I think it's a great question. For us, we don't have anything that really applies for this, but ultimately, it's whatever they identify as is how we would classify. If it's truly non-binary, then we call them Z.
Mhm.
There's no reason to force them into a classification that they don't identify with.
Yeah, I don't have a whole lot of that, but I would just say, yeah, you just have to be sensitive to those, and like, you don't have to, like I said, force people into categories. And as far as when I talk with clients about diversity, I talk about like on interview panels or part of the hiring process.
Mhm.
I always refer to diversity in all aspects, not just what I call
Right.
surface level diversity, which is kind of gender, ethnicity, also diversity of like work locations, of teams, of maybe work shifts. And so I always talk about diversity in all aspects. And so
Mhm.
it's more than just what I call surface level diversity.
Mhm. And more than visible diversity, I guess.
Yeah.
So we are very close to time. I'm going to see if we have maybe a last question. Just having a look here. Okay, how do the panelists feel, okay, very quickly, about a company's desire to hire more women in tech, but without increasing spend to open up sourcing channels in other areas that support being able to have a more diverse top of funnel? So yeah, companies that have that goal, but that aren't putting their money where their mouth is. How would you address that?
Sourcing from these groups to do require an investment to advertise with them. That is certainly one of the easiest ways to increase your top of funnel. But I've also been hiring in times of reduced expense capabilities,
Mm-hmm.
smaller budgets. You know, you can't spend $1 more in recruiting. So how do you really focus on the candidates that you are getting? And for us, very simple. The job descriptions are really what help. If you focus on the job descriptions, I think you'll naturally get more candidates that are applying organically. So that's how we were able to, without spending $1 more, get more candidates in. It's just focusing on the job description.
Mm-hmm. And I would say sometimes it's not about if it can't be dollars or euros or whatever, if it can't be money, sometimes it's investment of time. And sometimes you can make a difference just in where you're going to invest your time. Do you have uh, women in tech roles at your company who might be able to share with their network? Do they have any recommendations for you? Is there anyone you can reach out to? Is there anything, could you go and talk to someone, take part in a webinar? I don't know, other ways that you could sort of invest your time to make your company, your positions more visible. There are ways that you can maybe do that without spending more money.
Yeah, I
We
think
are
oftentimes
at,
I was going to add one quick thing.
yeah,
Oftentimes thinking outside of the box, companies may have funds allocated for conferences, for example. And if you
right.
empower and encourage internal female employees to go and present, you get that free advertising of this is a woman that we've empowered to represent us at the conference.
Right. Thank you so much, panelists, for being here. Thank you so much to the audience for all of your questions and for being so present in the chat. We will get the recording to you in the next couple of days, and I hope to discuss other interesting subjects with you very soon.